Long before Alexander carved his name into the world's memory, Macedonia was a land whispered about in the courts of Athens and Sparta with condescension. It was a rugged country, mountainous in its north, fertile in its plains, but never considered a true equal among the great Greek city-states. To the southern Greeks, Macedon was half-civilized, frontier land where kings ruled over a hardy but rough people. Shepherds tended their flocks in the highlands. Farmers toiled in the fertile plains of the Axios and Haliacmon rivers, and nobles, mounted on powerful war horses bred in the northern pastures, upheld traditions of blood feuds and shifting loyalty. It was not a place of marble temples and refined philosophy. Athens boasted Socrates and Plato. Macedon had smiths, farmers, and warriors. Yet beneath this ruggedness lay something potent. A people used to hardship, bound by loyalty to their king, and willing to follow strong leadership with a devotion the fractious city-states to the south often lacked. It was here, on this borderland between Greece and barbarian lands, that destiny prepared a stage. The man who would seize it was Philip, the youngest son of King Amyntas III. Philip was not born into luxury. His childhood was marked by political instability, assassination attempts, and foreign invasions. The Macedonian throne was fragile, often passing through bloodshed rather than smooth succession. By the time Philip reached adolescence, the kingdom was fragmented, its nobles unruly, and its enemies pressing on all sides. Yet adversity would shape him more than comfort ever could. When Philip was taken as a hostage to Thebes in 368 BCE, it might have seemed a humiliation. In truth, it became his education. Thebes was then the dominant power in Greece, its armies led by the great general Epaminondas, whose innovations in phalanx warfare had shattered Spartan supremacy. Here, Philip studied not in a classroom, but in the drill grounds, watching the discipline of hoplites, the clever use of oblique battle lines, and the power of cohesive formations. He absorbed lessons that Macedon had never known, that warfare could be as much about organization and innovation as about courage. While other young men dreamed of heroic duels, Philip envisioned armies moving like machines. He saw how training and structure could make men fight as one, and he resolved that if ever he held power in Macedon, he would forge his kingdom's rough warriors into something far deadlier than scattered bands of nobles. Philip returned to Macedonia in 364 BCE, only to find chaos. The kingdom teetered on collapse. Illyrians raided from the northwest, Thracians pressed from the east, and Paeonians struck from the north. Internal factions threatened to tear apart the royal line. His elder brothers had been killed, leaving him regent for his young nephew. Yet in truth, Philip was more than a caretaker. He was a survivor who had waited for this moment. One of his first acts was to secure the loyalty of the nobles, not with empty promises, but by demonstrating shrewdness and resolve. He knew Macedonian kingship was not absolute. It rested on persuading powerful clans that their fortunes aligned with the crown. He offered marriages, gifts, and command positions, but just as swiftly eliminated rivals who posed a threat. Diplomacy and ruthlessness walked hand in hand. But Philip's true genius lay not only in politics, but in transforming the way Macedonians fought. His vision was radical: to take the fragmented bands of warriors and mold them into a professional army unlike any in Greece. He extended the length of the traditional spear into the fearsome sarissa, a pike stretching over 18 feet. These long spears, carried in tight phalanx formations, created a wall of points impossible for hoplites to penetrate. Training became relentless. Farmers and shepherds drilled until they could hold formation over rocky terrain, their shields overlapping, their sarissas angled with deadly precision. Philip did not neglect the cavalry. Macedon's nobles had long prided themselves on horsemanship, but Philip organized them into the companion cavalry, a crack unit that would serve as the hammer to his phalanx's anvil. Under his system, the phalanx fixed the enemy in place, while the cavalry smashed through their flanks. It was a synthesis of Greek discipline and Macedonian tradition, and it turned a once derided kingdom into a rising military power. This transformation was not instant. It required resources, and Philip proved equally adept at securing them. He reorganized the economy, harnessing the gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaeon, whose revenues funded mercenaries, equipment, and training. He fortified cities, built roads to speed troop movements, and established new settlements to secure the frontiers. Within a few years, Macedon had gone from vulnerable to formidable, its enemies forced onto the defensive. The Illyrians, who had once humiliated Macedonia, were crushed in battle by Philip's reformed phalanx. Thracian tribes, long a menace, were bribed, coerced, or defeated into submission. For the first time in generations, Macedonia was secure, and not merely secure, but rising. Philip's ambitions extended far beyond survival. He saw that the Greek world to the south was divided, its city-states locked in perpetual quarrels, its alliances fragile, and its wars endless. Athens feared Sparta, Sparta resented Thebes, and smaller states sought advantage wherever they could. In this disunity, Philip saw opportunity. Step by step, he insinuated Macedon into Greek affairs. He used diplomacy to present himself not as a barbarian outsider, but as a legitimate player in Hellenic politics. He sponsored games, sent envoys, and married strategically his unions binding him to Thessaly, Epirus, and even minor Greek houses. Yet his diplomacy was always backed by steel. When persuasion failed, his armies marched, and one by one, Greek states found themselves compelled to reckon with the new Macedonian power. At Chaeronea, in 338 BCE, Philip revealed the full measure of his achievement. Facing a coalition of Athens and Thebes, the mightiest states of the south, his phalanx held firm, while his son, the young Alexander, led the companion cavalry in a decisive charge that shattered the Greek lines. The battle was not merely a victory. It was the end of an era. Greece's independence, fragmented and quarrelsome, was over. Macedon, once a backwater kingdom, now stood supreme. Philip, however, was no mere conqueror. His vision extended across the Aegean, toward the Persian Empire. He understood that the wealth and power of Asia lay ripe for the taking if only the Greeks could be united. Through the League of Corinth, he bound the city-states into a coalition, nominally of equals, but in truth under his dominance. His plan was audacious, to lead all of Greece against Persia, to avenge the invasions of Darius and Xerxes, and to establish Macedon as the master of a new world. Yet destiny is fickle. On the eve of his grand campaign, Philip fell to an assassin's blade at Aegae in 336 BCE. The motives remained debated: jealousy, politics, conspiracy, but his death abruptly ended his personal saga. Still, what he had built did not collapse. Instead, it passed to his 20-year-old son, Alexander, who would take his father's army, his father's vision, and carry them further than Philip himself could have dreamed. And so, the tale of the Macedonian Empire begins not with Alexander's conquests, but with Philip's transformation of a kingdom in the shadows into the rising star of the ancient world. Without Philip's reforms, his cunning, and his iron will, Alexander would have inherited only a fragile state. Instead, he inherited a war machine, a treasury, and a vision already aimed at Asia. The story that follows will trace how that inheritance reshaped the ancient world. But it all began here, in the mountains and plains of Macedon, where one man's determination turned obscurity into empire. The summer of 336 BCE was meant to mark the triumph of Philip II. At Aegae, the ancient capital of Macedonia, the court gathered for celebration. His daughter Cleopatra's marriage to Alexander of Epirus was a union of dynasties, meant to bind Macedonia with its western neighbor. The festival was grand, filled with music, games, and sacrifices to the gods. Nobles, in richly dyed cloaks, mingled with soldiers. Emissaries from Greek city-states looked on with cautious respect, and Philip walked among them with the confidence of a man who had risen from obscurity to dominance. But in a single moment, all that confidence turned to chaos. As Philip entered the theatre, unarmed and robed in ceremonial white, a bodyguard named Pausanias rushed forward. Before anyone could react, the assassin drove a dagger into the king's side. Philip collapsed, blood staining his robes, his voice silenced forever. Panic erupted in the crowd. Pausanias fled, but was cut down by Philip's guards before his motives could be fully unraveled. Macedon trembled. The king who had crushed the Illyrians, humbled Athens, broken Thebes, and united Greece was gone. Behind him, he left both glory and danger. His dream of invading Persia now hung suspended. His nobles, ambitious and restless, weighed the future. His wives and their factions whispered of succession, and in the center of this storm stood his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Alexander had been born to Philip's fourth wife, Olympias of Epirus, a woman fierce in her devotion to the gods and relentless in ambition for her son. From childhood, Alexander had been taught that his destiny was extraordinary. His mother told him stories of his descent from Achilles and Heracles. His father, though often absent at war or distracted by politics, recognized the boy's restless energy and sought to channel it. When Aristotle was summoned to Macedon as Alexander's tutor, the young prince was exposed not just to Homer's epic verses, but to philosophy, science, and the arts of leadership. Yet Alexander was never content with theory alone. He rode Bucephalus, the horse none but he could tame, and in doing so proved both courage and empathy. He fought in Philip's campaigns as a teenager, commanding cavalry at Chaeronea with stunning success. By the time Philip died, Alexander was no stranger to battle. Still, the throne of Macedon was no easy inheritance. Philip's death unleashed whispers of conspiracy. Some claimed Olympias had plotted it. Others pointed to rival generals or even Persian agents. Regardless of the truth, Alexander knew that hesitation meant death. He acted with ruthless speed. Rivals within the royal family were executed, including Amyntas IV, a cousin with potential claims. Rebellious nobles were crushed. Even his mother's enemies were swept aside. Macedon would not be allowed to fracture. To the Greeks, Philip's death looked like opportunity. Athens and Thebes dreamed of shaking off Macedonian control. In the north, Thracians stirred. Tribes beyond the Danube muttered about reclaiming lands. And in Asia, the Persian satraps watched with interest, calculating whether the boy king would falter. Alexander had no time to grieve. If he did not prove himself immediately, Philip's empire would crumble before it even began. The first tests came swiftly. In Thessaly, rebellion broke out. Alexander marched south with astonishing speed, his phalanx cutting across mountain passes before his enemies expected him. When Thessalian horsemen blocked his way, Alexander did not fight them directly. He outmaneuvered them, seizing high ground and forcing them to submit. Within weeks, Thessaly was pacified and bound again to Macedon. Next came Greece itself. At the Isthmus of Corinth, Alexander asserted his claim to the leadership of the Hellenic League his father had forged. Some cities grumbled, but his authority held. Then came the news that Thebes had risen in open revolt, spurred on by rumors that Alexander had died in northern campaigns. Thebes was no minor city. It was proud, once supreme in Greece, and its rebellion threatened to unravel all Philip had built. Alexander responded with terrifying decisiveness. He marched 300 miles in 2 weeks, arriving before the Thebans even knew he lived. His army encircled the city. When the Thebans resisted, Alexander ordered the assault. The Macedonian phalanx stormed the walls. The companion cavalry tore through the streets. Thebes was razed, its people slaughtered or sold into slavery. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message was unmistakable. Defiance against Macedon meant destruction. The Greeks, horrified, submitted. Athens, though shaken, dared not resist openly. Sparta, weakened and isolated, stayed quiet. In one stroke, Alexander secured his southern flank. Yet even as Greece bent to his will, threats surged elsewhere. Beyond the Danube, tribes gathered to test the young king. Alexander crossed the great river in daring night raids, burning villages, breaking enemy coalitions, and showing that not even nature's boundaries could halt him. In Thrace, he marched through treacherous mountain passes, scattering tribes that had long plagued Macedon. Each campaign hardened his army and spread his legend. By the time he returned to Pella, his throne was secure. His enemies were crushed, his allies cowed, his soldiers loyal. Macedon stood unchallenged. And now, with the land secure and Greece subdued, Alexander turned his eyes east toward Persia, the ancient empire that loomed across the Aegean. Vast, wealthy, and ripe for conquest. What Philip had dreamed, Alexander would attempt. But first, he had to bind together the League of Greeks, settle his kingdom, and prepare the campaign that would forever change history. In the spring of 334 BCE, the harbours of Macedon bustled with a new purpose. Ships were loaded with grain, weapons, and horses. Soldiers drilled on the plains, their sarissas gleaming in the sunlight, their armour polished for the campaign ahead. At their head stood Alexander, now king, no longer shadowed by his father, ready to attempt what Philip had planned but never lived to see, the invasion of Persia. The Persian Empire stretched from Anatolia to Babylon. From Egypt to the Indus, the largest empire the world had yet seen. To many Greeks, it was an immovable giant, too vast to conquer, too wealthy to topple. Yet, Alexander's confidence was absolute. To his men, he was not merely a king, but a leader chosen by the gods, a second Achilles destined to bring down Asia. Before departing, Alexander made his way to Troy, the ancient city of Homer's epics, or what was believed to be its ruins. There, among crumbled walls and wind-swept plains, he offered sacrifices to Athena and honored the memory of Achilles. He took the hero's shield, or what local tradition said was Achilles' own, and left his own armor in exchange. The gesture was clear. He was casting himself as heir to the greatest warrior of myth, and his campaign as the continuation of a saga begun centuries before. His men, many of whom had grown up reciting Homer's verses, understood. They marched not merely for conquest, but for glory. The Macedonian army numbered around 40,000 men, phalanx, infantry, companion cavalry, archers, light troops, engineers, and siege specialists. It was not the largest force ever assembled, but it was the most disciplined and versatile the world had seen. Every man knew his place, his drill, and the voice of command that bound them into a single organism. When Alexander led them across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, it was more than a logistical feat. It was a symbolic crossing, leaving behind the old world of Greece to enter the boundless East. Standing on the Asian shore, Alexander hurled a spear into the soil and declared the land conquered in advance. A dramatic gesture that fused ritual with ambition. His men cheered, believing destiny itself marched with them. The Persian satraps in Anatolia, alarmed by the invasion, rallied their forces. They were not united. Persian governors often distrusted each other, but they gathered an army, reinforced with Greek mercenaries. Their strategy was simple: block Alexander at the rivers, deny him access inland, and crush his army before it could establish itself. To them, this was just another rebellion to be put down. To Alexander, it was the first gate of empire. The two armies met on the banks of the Granicus River, a torrent swollen by spring rains. The Persians lined the opposite shore, their cavalry massed in glittering ranks, their infantry behind them. The river itself, with steep, muddy banks, was meant to break the Macedonian advance before it even reached Persian lines. Alexander surveyed the scene. His generals urged caution. To attack across a river into waiting cavalry was madness, they said. A delay, a maneuver upstream, might yield safer ground. But Alexander rejected hesitation. Boldness, he believed, was half the battle. If he faltered now, on his first engagement, his allies would waver, his enemies would grow confident, and his legend would be tarnished before it began. At sunset, with the light catching his helmet's white plumes, Alexander mounted Bucephalus and prepared his cavalry. Trumpets sounded. The phalanx began to advance, shields raised, sarissas lowered. The companion cavalry, Alexander at their head, thundered into the river. Spray leapt around them as horses struggled through the current, arrows hissing overhead. The Persians charged downhill, shouting in many tongues, their lances aimed at the invaders. For a moment, chaos reigned, men grappling in the water, horses colliding, weapons breaking in the rush. But Alexander pressed forward, his sarissa thrusting, his men forming ranks even as they climbed the opposite bank. The Macedonian discipline held. Step by step, they forced their way upward. Alexander, as always, fought in the thick of it. He sought out leaders, cutting through lesser men to reach the Persian nobles glittering in their armor. At one point, he nearly fell, struck by a blow that split his helmet and grazed his skull, but his companions shielded him, and he rallied, killing the satrap Mithridates with a spear thrust. Once the Macedonians gained the bank, their phalanx extended, their spears leveled in unison, and the Persian cavalry broke. They were unused to an enemy that fought not in scattered charges, but as a solid wall of steel. Panic spread. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia resisted longer, but they too were encircled, cut down with relentless efficiency. When the battle ended, the riverbank was littered with bodies. Persian nobles lay among their retainers, their arrogance drowned in blood. Alexander stood victorious, his army bloodied but exultant. The first test had been passed. The first Persian army destroyed. The victory at Granicus was more than tactical. It sent shockwaves through Asia Minor. Cities once loyal to Persia opened their gates to Alexander, either out of admiration or fear. The myth of Persian invincibility, nurtured since the days of Xerxes, and Alexander, barely 22 years old, had proven himself not just Philip's son, but a commander in his own right. Bold, ruthless, and unstoppable. From the riverbanks of Anatolia, the road now stretched open to Sardis, to Halicarnassus, and beyond, deeper into the heart of Persia's empire. The world had begun to realize that the boy king of Macedon was no mere pretender. He was a storm descending on Asia, and nothing would be the same. When the echoes of victory at the Granicus faded, Alexander faced a sobering truth. He had cut into Persia's flesh, But the empire still breathed, vast and unbroken. If the Persians could regroup, strike his fleet, and sever his lifeline back to Macedonia, his campaign might end as a brief incursion, another failed Greek adventure into Asia. He had no fleet strong enough to challenge Persian naval supremacy. Their triremes controlled the Aegean, and could at any moment sail against Macedon itself, stir rebellion in Greece, or choke the supply routes of his army. Alexander's answer was audacious. He would win the sea war on land. The harbours that sustained Persia's fleet, Sardis, Miletus, Halicarnassus, and others scattered along the Anatolian coast, became his targets. If he could seize these strongholds, Persia's navy would wither, denied safe havens, shipyards, and provisions. He would strangle an empire's fleet without needing one of his own. But to do this, he would have to move quickly, break garrisons before Darius could send reinforcements, and show mercy in some places, ruthless terror in others, so that cities across Asia Minor would decide surrender was safer than resistance. Sardis was first. The approach to Sardis was quiet. The plains of Lydia, golden under late summer light. Its acropolis rose like a crown above the land. Ancient walls bearing the memory of Croesus, the fabled king who had once defied Cyrus of Persia. The Persian satrap of Sardis, Mithraenes, stood at the gates and looked down upon the advancing Macedonians. He could fight, but he had seen the Granicus. He had heard of Persian nobles cut down by Alexander's spear. Resistance meant ruin. Surrender meant survival. Mithraenes chose the latter. He opened the gates, surrendered the treasury, and placed the city in Alexander's hands without a battle. Alexander entered as a liberator, his cloak bright against the stone of the city. He offered sacrifices to Cybele, the local mother goddess, and announced that the Lydians would govern themselves with their old laws. It was a masterstroke. No lootings, no massacres, no blood-staining Sardis' streets. Macedonian garrisons remained, but the people saw him as something more than a conqueror, a man who respected their gods and traditions. Word of this mercy travelled faster than his army could march. In towns still debating resistance, whispers grew. Alexander spares those who yield, but his mercy had limits. For the Persians, it was a signal. The young Macedonian king was building something larger than a raid. Sardis' surrender was the first unseaming of Persian power in Asia Minor. From there, Alexander pressed south along the coast, to places where submission would not come so easily. If Sardis fell with a whisper, Halicarnassus answered with a roar. The jewel of Korea, Halicarnassus was famed for the mausoleum of Mausolus, one of the wonders of the world, and for its impregnable harbour. Its walls were high, its towers bristling, its defenders numerous. Within the city commanded Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary loyal to Persia, and Orontobates, the Persian satrap. Memnon was no ordinary soldier. He was a strategist who had studied Macedonian methods and understood that Alexander's brilliance could be met only with stubborn resistance and guile. As Alexander's phalanx encamped outside the city, Halicarnassus braced itself. Siege engines creaked into place. Massive wooden towers clad in hides to resist fire. Rams fashioned from felled timbers of the Anatolian forests. Catapults wheeled into position. Day after day, the Macedonians advanced their engines to the walls, hurling stones and bolts, battering gates. From above, defenders rained arrows and flaming pitch. At night, Memnon unleashed sorties. Small groups of soldiers rushing out of sally ports to set siege towers alight, hacking at catapult ropes, vanishing back into the city before the phalanx could trap them. The night sky glowed red with burning machines. Macedonian soldiers cursed in the dark as their work collapsed in sparks and ash. Alexander did not relent. He ordered his engineers to rebuild, to dig mines beneath the walls, tunnels snaked under the earth, timbers bracing them as men hacked at stone foundations. Sometimes, the defenders detected the mines and dug counter-tunnels, and beneath the city walls, men fought in smoky darkness with picks, daggers, and fire. Other times, an entire wall section thundered down, Macedonian phalanx surging into the breach, only to be repelled by desperate defenders fighting house to house. The siege dragged on for weeks. Disease whispered through the camp, supplies strained, and even Alexander's soldiers murmured that perhaps the gods had raised Halicarnassus beyond mortal reach. But the young king refused to let doubt spread. He rode among his men, his presence steady, his voice promising that the fall of this city would break the Persian hold on the sea. Finally, Memnon realized the city was lost. He ordered a scorched retreat. Stores burned, ships scuttled, houses torched. Halicarnassus, though not conquered by storm, was left a ruin. When Alexander's men entered, the streets smoldered, the air choked with smoke, the once beautiful mausoleum scarred by flame. Here too, Alexander showed balance. He punished those who resisted, but he spared survivors, and he made a bold political move. He restored Ada, the exiled Carian queen, to her throne. She had offered her loyalty and, according to tradition, adopted Alexander as her son, binding Caria to him not by conquest alone, but by family ties. In this, Alexander revealed something profound. He was not merely smashing walls, but weaving himself into the very fabric of the lands he took. With the coast secured, Alexander turned inland, toward the heart of Phrygia. There, in the old capital of Gordium, he encountered not a fortress, but a legend. In the palace courtyard stood an ancient wagon, bound to its yoke with a knot of bark so twisted, so entangled, that no end could be found. The Gordian knot, legend declared, would only be untied by the one destined to rule Asia. Crowds gathered as Alexander examined the knot. His companions muttered. Some believed he should attempt to unravel it patiently, as others had tried and failed. Alexander's eyes glittered. He asked the oracle if cutting counted as untying. Receiving no answer, he drew his sword and with a single stroke cleaved the knot apart. The ends fell loose. Gasps rippled through the assembly. Some called it desecration, others divine boldness. Alexander called it destiny. It does not matter how, he said, only that it is undone. The story spread like wildfire across Anatolia and beyond. Whether through divine favor or ruthless practicality, Alexander had fulfilled the prophecy. To his soldiers, it was proof that their march was blessed. To the Persians, it was a chilling omen. The Macedonian was not just a warrior, but a figure of fate. The stop at Gordium was more than symbolism. It was a pause to consolidate. Reinforcements arrived from Macedon. Alliances were secured. Garrisons were placed in key cities. The army, rested and supplied, prepared for the next stage. For Alexander knew that Persia would not remain passive. Darius III, the great king, was assembling a force vast beyond imagining. Summoning satraps from Babylon, cavalry from Bactria, archers from the east, and mercenaries from Greece. The storm was gathering, but for now, Alexander had achieved what few thought possible. In less than a year, he had carved the Persian grip from Asia Minor, humbled its satraps, broken its garrisons, and secured his rear. The road to the heart of the empire lay open. His men, hardened by siege and march, whispered of the battles to come, and their king, still in his early 20s, rode at their head with the confidence of one who believed destiny itself marched with him. The true collision was still ahead at Issus, at Gaugamela, where Alexander would meet the great king face to face. But Asia Minor had already bent to his will, and the world was beginning to sense that nothing could halt the tide he had unleashed. By the summer of 333 BCE, Alexander had conquered the Aegean coast and secured Asia Minor. But the campaign was no longer a chess game with satraps. Word spread across the empire. Darius III, the King of Kings, was mustering his full strength. From the heart of Persia, messengers galloped east and west, summoning levies from Babylon, cavalry from Media, horse archers from Bactria, spearmen from India, and mercenaries from Greece. What had begun as a Macedonian raid would now become a trial by fire, the might of Persia against the will of a single man. Alexander marched his army through Phrygia and down into the Cilician Gates, a narrow mountain pass where cliffs pressed so tight that a column of men stretched single file along the path. The descent into Cilicia was grueling, the air heavy with heat, dust caking their armor. Many soldiers fell ill, weary from endless marches and poor water. Even Alexander himself nearly perished, stricken by fever after bathing in the cold river Cydnus. Rumors whispered through the camp that the gods had struck him down, but his physician, Philip of Acarnania, administered a bitter draught medicine so strong that some suspected poison. Alexander, with unshakable calm, drank it even as he read a letter warning him that the doctor had been bribed. His trust was vindicated. Within days he rose from his bed, pale but smiling, walking among the men. The army roared in relief. If their king lived, nothing was impossible. Cilicia became his base, and here he prepared for the coming clash. Scouts reported the Persian host was vast, a sea of men stretching across the plains of Syria. Darius himself had taken the field, a rare move for a great king, determined to crush the insolent invader and restore imperial pride. For Alexander, this was destiny, a chance to strike not at satraps or mercenaries, but at the king of the empire itself. Darius marched north with an army that ancient sources exaggerated into hundreds of thousands, though modern reckoning places it closer to 100,000, still vastly larger than Alexander's 40,000. His chariots rattled, his cavalry gleamed, his banners of the god Ahura Mazda fluttered in the Syrian wind. His presence was meant to awe allies and intimidate enemies. The King of Kings, seated in a golden chariot, surrounded by his royal guard, jewels flashing, his authority unquestioned. Alexander's army, leaner but hardened by months of campaign, marched south. Their phalanx was iron discipline incarnate, the sarissas bristling in unison, the companion cavalry eager, their young king at their head. But fate twisted unexpectedly. Instead of meeting on the plains, where Persian numbers would have crushed the Macedonians, the armies stumbled upon each other near the small town of Issus. It was a reversal of fortune. Darius had maneuvered behind Alexander, cutting him off from Greece, but in doing so, he trapped his own massive army in a narrow coastal plain where numbers could not deploy to advantage. The stage was set not for Persian dominance, but for Macedonian brilliance. The river Pinaris ran across the plain, shallow but with steep banks. On one side, the Persians arrayed their cavalry and infantry. On the other, Alexander deployed his phalanx, light troops, and cavalry. The sea shimmered to the west, the mountains loomed to the east, and between them stretched a strip of land soon to be soaked in blood. At dusk, the battle erupted. Persian arrows darkened the sky, their infantry surging to the riverbank. The Macedonian phalanx advanced with steady steps, sarissas angled like a bristling hedge, shields locked, drums pounding. The river's banks slowed them, but their discipline held. On the left, the Persian cavalry crashed against the Thessalian horse, a swirling melee of spears, shouts, and trampling hooves. Dust rose in choking clouds, the clash of bronze and iron echoing off the mountains. The Thessalians bent but did not break, buying time for Alexander's decisive move. On the right, Alexander himself led the companion cavalry in a thunderous charge. He aimed not at the mass of Persian infantry, but at the heart, where Darius's golden chariot gleamed amidst the royal guard. Cutting diagonally across the field, his men broke through Persian cavalry, spearing nobles, scattering retainers. The shock of their charge ripped the Persian line apart. Panic spread. Darius, seeing Alexander's plumes driving toward him, faltered. Ancient accounts say he turned his chariot and fled, his guards streaming after him. Whether in fear or strategy, the effect was the same. The Persian center collapsed. Once their king retreated, the vast host dissolved into chaos. Soldiers who had sworn to die for empire now ran, crushed in bottlenecks against riverbanks. Trampled in panic by their own cavalry, the Macedonians pressed the rout mercilessly. Thousands were slain, tens of thousands captured. The Persian camp, rich with treasure, fell into their hands. Even more shocking, the royal family, Darius's mother, wife, and children, were taken prisoner. Alexander treated them with respect, promising their safety and earning not just loyalty from his own men, but admiration from allies who saw that this conqueror possessed both ferocity and honor. Issus was more than a battle. It was a revelation. For the first time, Darius himself had faced Alexander and fled. The myth of Persian invincibility, already cracked at Granicus, now lay shattered. The King of Kings had been humbled by a youth from Macedon, and across the known world, from Athens to Babylon, men began to whisper that Alexander was not merely lucky, not merely bold, but truly unstoppable. The road now led south toward Egypt and east toward the heart of Persia. The war was far from over, but Issus had transformed its meaning. This was no longer a contest of generals. It was personal. Alexander against Darius. Destiny. After Issus, Alexander's name thundered across Asia. Darius had fled, leaving his family in Macedonian hands, and the Persians' prestige crumbled. Yet Alexander knew the empire was not beaten. Persian naval supremacy still lingered. The Phoenician cities, Sidon, Byblos, and above all Tyre, were the keystones of Persia's fleet. Without them, the empire could still threaten Greece and his rear. Sidon surrendered without resistance, welcoming Alexander as a liberator. Byblos followed, but Tyre, proud island fortress, refused. Its walls rose sheer from the sea, its harbours filled with ships, its people stubborn in their independence. The Tyrians told Alexander they would honour him, but only as a guest, not as a master. To the young conqueror, this was defiance he could not ignore. Thus began one of the most famous sieges in history. Tyre lay half a mile offshore, separated from the mainland by deep water. Most kings would have accepted the impossibility and moved on. Alexander instead resolved to build a causeway, a massive mole stretching from shore to island, stone by stone, timber by timber. His engineers and soldiers laboured endlessly, driving piles into the seabed, layering earth and rubble, advancing yard by yard. The Tyrians struck back with ferocity. Their ships harassed the builders. Their engines hurled stones and arrows. Fireships crashed against the mole, setting timbers ablaze, sending smoke and screams skyward. Time and again the causeway was destroyed, and time and again Alexander ordered it rebuilt. He summoned ships from conquered Phoenician ports, turning Persia's own fleet against them. Slowly, inexorably, the Macedonian siege tightened. After 7 brutal months, the mole reached the island walls. Towers rolled forward, engines battered stone, and at last a breach opened. Macedonian phalanx stormed through, companion cavalry dismounted and fighting on foot. Rage unleashed after months of frustration. Tyre was taken in blood, thousands were slain, thousands more sold into slavery. Yet even in victory, Alexander's message was clear. Defiance brought ruin, submission brought mercy. The fall of Tyre shook the world. A city thought unconquerable had fallen. Persia's naval power crumbled. Alexander had done what no Greek before him had dreamed, shattered the empire's shield on the sea. From Tyre, Alexander moved south. Most cities of Phoenicia opened their gates, but Gaza, a fortress on the desert's edge, resisted. Built upon high ground, with walls reinforced by Persian engineers, it was a thorn on the road to Egypt. Alexander laid siege, his engines battering the walls. For 2 months the struggle raged, sorties and counter-sallies clashing in dust and blood. Twice Alexander himself was wounded, once pierced in the shoulder by a missile, once struck in the thigh. Yet he fought on, directing his men, refusing to yield. Finally the walls crumbled. The phalanx surged in, and Gaza fell. The city was punished harshly, its defenders slain or enslaved. Alexander's wounds healed, but the lesson remained. No fortress, no matter how high, could bar his path. Southward he marched, into Egypt, where destiny waited. Egypt had long groaned under Persian rule, its temples defiled, its people taxed to exhaustion. When Alexander crossed into the Nile Valley, the priests and people greeted him not as conqueror, but as liberator. At Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, son of Ra, ruler of the two lands. He offered sacrifices to the gods of Egypt, ordered temples restored, and honored traditions older than Greece itself. Yet Alexander's ambitions reached beyond politics. In the western desert lay the oracle of Ammon at Siwa, a shrine so ancient that even pharaohs had sought its wisdom. Legends said its priests spoke the voice of Zeus Ammon, a fusion of Greek and Egyptian divinity. Alexander set out across the desert, his caravan staggering under scorching sun, sandstorms threatening to consume them. At moments when death seemed certain, sudden rains fell, or birds appeared to guide the way. Omens his men whispered were proof of divine favor. At last, he entered the oasis, the temple, rising among palm trees and springs. Inside, in the dim sanctum, the priests greeted him with reverence. What they whispered to Alexander has never been fully recorded. Some say they hailed him as the son of Ammon, others that they confirmed his destiny to rule the world. Whatever words were spoken, Alexander emerged, transformed, convinced more deeply than ever that his conquest was not mere ambition, but a divine mission. On his return to Egypt, he founded a city at the mouth of the Nile, Alexandria. He designed it himself, laying out streets in a grid, envisioning harbors, temples, and libraries. It would become not only a port, but a beacon of Hellenic culture, a bridge between East and West, a city that bore his name and endured long after his empire. With Egypt secured, Persia's western flank was broken. Alexander now commanded men, ships, and cities from the Nile to the Hellespont. His image was no longer just of king or general, but of a figure touched by gods. The next stage lay east, into Mesopotamia, where Darius would gather his strength once more. The true heart of the empire awaited, and the clash to decide the fate of the known world was drawing near. When Alexander marched out of Egypt in the spring of 331 BCE, his men felt as though they were following more than a king. They had crowned him pharaoh, seen him hailed as the son of Ammon, and witnessed cities fall before him, as if destiny itself cleared the path. Now the road lay eastward into the beating heart of Persia. Behind him lay the Nile and the harbors of Alexandria. Ahead stretched deserts, rivers, and the great capitals of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis. The march was grueling. Across Syria and into the Euphrates Valley, the Macedonian army advanced, the sun hammering down on helmets, dust clogging lungs. Scouts rode ahead, reporting Persian activity. Darius was not hiding in Susa or Babylon. He was gathering his forces for a confrontation unlike any before. The King of Kings had learned the lessons of Issus. He would not trap himself in narrow ground again. He would choose the battlefield vast, open, perfect for cavalry, chariots, and overwhelming numbers. At the Euphrates, Alexander crossed unopposed. At the Tigris, Persian cavalry harassed him but could not hold the banks. Each river crossed brought the Macedonians deeper into the empire's heart. By autumn, they reached the plain of Gaugamela, near Arbela, where Darius awaited. The plain had been carefully prepared. Persian engineers leveled the ground for miles, removing rocks and filling hollows so that scythed chariots could sweep across unhindered. Darius's army stretched across the horizon. Estimates in ancient sources reach fantastical numbers, but even conservative reckonings suggest 200,000 men, perhaps 5 times Alexander's force. Cavalry from every satrapy, elephants from India, armored horsemen from Bactria, archers from the east, Greek mercenaries hardened by years of war, all had come. At the center stood Darius in a high chariot, surrounded by his royal guard, the symbol of empire itself. Alexander had perhaps 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. His men were veterans now, their sarissas steady, their discipline unshaken. Yet, as they looked upon the Persian host, even hardened soldiers must have felt the weight of numbers. It was as though all Asia had risen against them. Alexander rode the lines, speaking to his men, reminding them of Issus, of Tyre, of Egypt. "We fight not for survival," he told them, "but for mastery of the world." At dawn on October 1, 331 BCE, the armies advanced. The Persians spread wide, intending to envelop the Macedonians on all sides. Darius unleashed his chariots first, scythed wheels flashing, horses galloping across the leveled plain. But Alexander had prepared. His light infantry opened corridors in the phalanx, letting the chariots race harmlessly through, then swarmed them with spears and javelins. Horses fell, drivers were cut down, and the terror weapon of Persia failed. Then the true battle began. On the Macedonian left, the Persian cavalry crashed against the Thessalians, pressing hard, threatening to break through. On the right, Alexander held back, refusing to commit too soon. His phalanx advanced steadily, their long spears glittering. Dust rose in choking clouds. The clash of iron echoed across the plain. Men fell by the thousands, and still the lines held. Then came Alexander's decisive stroke. Seeing a gap open in the Persian center, he wheeled his companion cavalry into a wedge and charged. Like a spearhead, they drove into the heart of the Persian line, straight toward Darius's chariot. The king, once more confronted with the sight of the Macedonian king thundering toward him, lost his nerve. He turned and fled, his guards scattering with him. Panic rippled outward, but this time the battle did not collapse instantly. On the Macedonian left, the Persian cavalry pressed so hard that for a moment, Alexander's army risked being enveloped. Alexander faced a choice: pursue Darius and end the empire in a single blow, or turn back to save his men. He chose his army. Wheeling his cavalry, he struck the Persian flank, relieving the pressure, stabilizing the line. Only when his men were secure did he resume pursuit. But by then, Darius had vanished into the east. The field was a slaughter. Tens of thousands of Persians lay dead, the plain littered with broken chariots, shattered spears, and abandoned standards. The difference was not numbers, but discipline, leadership, and the iron will of men who believed themselves invincible. The victory at Gaugamela was more than a battle. It was the death knell of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius fled east with a handful of followers, his prestige shattered. Babylon, jewel of Mesopotamia, opened its gates to Alexander. The priests of Marduk welcomed him. Treasures beyond imagining poured into his coffers. Susa followed, its palaces glittering with gold and silver, storerooms filled with tribute from across Asia. Persepolis. For the Macedonians, Gaugamela was proof that their king was not merely a brilliant general, but a figure touched by destiny. For the Persians, it was catastrophe, the collapse of centuries of empire. Yet, Alexander's task was not done. To hold what he had taken, he would have to pursue Darius across the eastern satrapies, confront rebellions, and prove that his conquest was more than a blaze of victories. But on that autumn plain near Arbela, the fate of empires had been decided. A kingdom once mocked as barbarian had broken the greatest power of the ancient world, and at its head rode a man barely 25 years old, whose ambition now stretched beyond Persia, beyond Asia, toward horizons no conqueror had yet dared to dream. The road from Gaugamela led straight into the heart of Persia, and Alexander marched as if destiny itself had cleared the way. Babylon, proud jewel of Mesopotamia, was the first to fall into his hands. The walls that had defied Assyrians, Chaldeans, and Persians now opened without resistance. Priests of Marduk, keepers of traditions older than Macedon itself, bowed before him, hailing him as the chosen of their god. Alexander, ever mindful of symbolism, entered not as a looter, but as a king. He offered sacrifice in the temple of Marduk, restored rituals long ignored under Persian neglect, and in doing so, won the loyalty of Babylon's ancient priesthood. The city welcomed him, not as a conqueror, but as a new guardian. From Babylon he marched to Susa, where the palaces of the Achaemenid kings gleamed with enamel walls and cedar beams. Here the wealth of the empire had been stored for generations. Gold piled in endless rooms, treasures from India, Egypt, and Lydia, tribute from 100 nations. Alexander seized it all, an avalanche of wealth so vast that mule trains and camel caravans strained for months under its weight. The treasure of Susa was said to be enough to pay his soldiers for decades. To his men, it was the confirmation that their suffering and marching were worth it. To Alexander, it was the material foundation for something greater than any king had ever attempted. But beyond Babylon and Susa lay Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, the seat of Persian pride. Situated against the Zagros Mountains, its terraces rose like a stairway to heaven, bearing the palaces of Darius the Great and Xerxes. Reliefs carved into its walls depicted kings receiving tribute from all corners of the empire: Ethiopians, Indians, Medes, Scythians. To Persians, it was sacred ground, the heart of their identity. To Greeks, it was a bitter reminder, for Xerxes, who had once burned Athens, had walked these very halls. When Alexander entered Persepolis in early 330 BCE, he allowed his men to revel in its riches. Storehouses of gold and silver were emptied, so vast that coinage in the Greek world would forever bear traces of this influx. Caravans wound endlessly down the mountain roads, laden with treasure. Soldiers roamed streets wide-eyed, marveling at the palaces, drinking in the splendor of a city that seemed carved for gods. For a time, Alexander himself showed restraint, respecting the sanctity of the palaces. He walked their halls as though measuring himself against the kings who had built them. But then came the infamous night. Accounts differ, colored by rumor and politics. Some say it began as a drunken revel, with Alexander feasting among companions and courtesans. Thais, an Athenian courtesan, is said to have raised her cup and urged him to avenge Greece, to burn the palaces of Xerxes, who had once set Athens aflame. Whether spurred by wine or by calculation, Alexander rose with a torch, and soon flames licked the cedar beams. The fire spread quickly, roaring across gilded roofs, devouring columns, illuminating the night sky with a terrible brilliance. For miles across the plain, people watched as Persepolis, symbol of Persia's glory, became a pyre. Macedonian soldiers cheered, some dancing drunkenly in the glow. But others stood silent, awestruck, realizing that they were watching not only vengeance, but also loss, an irreplaceable jewel of human civilization, collapsing into ash. By dawn, the palaces were smoldering ruins. The terraces remained, but Persia's pride was gone. Alexander himself, it is said, regretted the destruction when sobriety returned. He had burned not only Xerxes' halls, but also the memory of a world empire. Some claimed he wept, that he walked the ruins in silence, touched by shame. Yet the message was clear to all. The old empire was dead, and from its ashes, something new would arise. Even as Persepolis smoldered, Darius III lived but barely as a king. After his flight from Gaugamela, he sought to rally loyal satraps in Media and Parthia. Messengers rode out across the east, summoning levies, but fewer returned. The satraps whispered that the gods had abandoned him, that the man who fled from Issus and Gaugamela could no longer claim the mantle of King of Kings. His generals obeyed him outwardly, but in private, they plotted their own survival. Alexander pursued with relentless speed. Across the Zagros mountains, through snow and desert, his phalanx marched, cavalry scouts ranging far ahead. In Media, he wintered, building strength, then set out again in spring, always chasing the rumor of Darius's flight. His men, hardened by conquest, now marched not for plunder, but for the finish. They knew that if Darius lived, rebellion could always be kindled. To end Persia, they must end its king. The chase ended in betrayal. Bessus, satrap of Bactria, along with other Persian nobles, seized Darius. They claimed loyalty, but their true motive was fear. They believed that by handing Darius over, they could win favor with Alexander, or at least buy time. But as Macedonian cavalry closed in near the Caspian gates in summer 330 BCE, panic overcame them. Rather than deliver their captive alive, they stabbed him and fled east, leaving him bleeding in a cart on the dusty road. When Alexander's men found him, the once great King of Kings lay dying, abandoned by his own. Accounts say Alexander cradled him, covered him with his cloak, and promised that his family would be honored. In some versions, Darius spoke with his final breath, naming Alexander his heir, recognizing the inevitability of his conqueror's destiny. Whether true or propaganda, the effect was profound. Darius, last of the Achaemenids, died not in battle, but in betrayal. His reign, marked by flight and defeat, ended with desertion. With him fell a dynasty that had ruled Asia for 2 centuries. From the Indus to the Aegean, Alexander buried him with honor in the royal tombs near Persepolis, presenting himself not merely as the man who destroyed Persia, but as the heir who now wore its crown. Darius's death transformed Alexander's role. No longer was he just the king of Macedon, hegemon of Greece, or even conqueror of Persia. He was now Lord of Asia, heir to Cyrus the Great, master of lands stretching from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush. Yet conquest was only the beginning. To govern such an empire required more than battlefield genius. It demanded vision. Alexander began to adopt Persian customs, not as affectation, but as policy. He retained satraps where they proved loyal, showing that submission did not mean dispossession. He married Persian princesses and encouraged his companions to take wives from the nobility of the East. At Susa, in 324 BCE, he staged mass weddings between Macedonian nobles and Persian women, a symbolic act, weaving 2 worlds together, forging a single aristocracy that would bind East and West. He himself began to wear Persian robes on occasion, and he introduced the expectation of proskynesis, the bow of submission before a great king. To Persians, this was natural, a sign of reverence. To Macedonians, it was shocking, for Greeks bowed only to the gods. Many grumbled that Alexander was abandoning their ways, that he sought not to be king but to be worshipped. Yet Alexander pressed on, for he saw himself not merely as a Greek hero but as a universal monarch, uniting peoples under one dominion. Life in his empire changed. Macedonian soldiers settled in garrisons, marrying local women, raising families. Markets in Babylon bustled with goods from Greece, Egypt, India, and beyond. Scholars traveled with the army, cataloguing plants, animals, and cultures. The world was no longer a mosaic of separate kingdoms. It was becoming a single stage, and Alexander, its central figure. But the empire was restless. Bessus, the betrayer of Darius, declared himself king in distant Bactria, rallying horse archers and rebels on the steppes. Other satraps hesitated, uncertain whether to yield fully to this young Macedonian, who now wore Persian robes. To secure his rule, Alexander would march farther still, into lands of snow peaks and endless grass, across the Oxus and Jaxartes, against peoples who had never bowed to Persia. His ambition, once the defeat of Darius, now stretched toward horizons beyond even Persia's reach. The burning of Persepolis, the death of Darius, the assumption of the Persian mantle, these were the turning points. In scarcely 3 years, Alexander had transformed from the young king, defending his throne at home, into the master of Asia, heir to Cyrus, rival to the gods. His men followed him, some awed, some uneasy, but all bound by loyalty, fear, and the magnetism of his vision. The world was no longer the world of Persia, nor the old world of Greece. It was becoming, unmistakably, the world of Alexander.